Snow remembers every footprint. In the Ardennes winter of early 1945, that meant every mistake was a record, every bold move, a script the enemy could read. The wind was small and mean, tugging at scarves and the loose ends of courage. The Battle of the Bulge had crested and broken, but in its backwash, the woods still held ghosts and patrols felt their way through fields where fences were buried and hedgerows rose like dark suggestions under drifts. He was a UC First Sergeant in a parachute infantry regiment, a compact man with a Pittsburgh steel-town jaw and a supply, sergeant's practicality, stuffed into the shoulders of a fighter. The patch on his sleeve was a Red Devil, the 82nd Airborne's 508th Parachute Infantry, and the line of his helmet told you he'd been wearing it too long to be sentimental about it. He had dropped into France in a pre-dawn that smelled of salt and cordite, fought through the creases of Holland while the bridges learned new names, and now he was staring at the stubbornness of a German winter that did not care whose plans were written on maps. His weapon was not theory. It was a Thompson submachine gun with a sort of blunt elegance that leaves little to interpret. They called it the Chicago piano because it played quick, decisive music, the kind that changed the subject of any room it entered. He worked the action with the simple, efficient gestures of a man who had carried more than his share of loads up muddy roads. He was the kind of non-commissioned officer you never noticed until it mattered, and then you noticed him first. His men trusted him in the way paratroopers trust to shoot, with the understanding that nobody gets a second chance if the first goes wrong. The little Belgian village ahead, call it Holzheim or one of its cousins, a scatter of low houses cupped in fields and woodlots, was the sort of place war adopts like a stray. A church spire stuck up into a gray, bruised sky, and somewhere a cow complained as if the war were an inconvenience to its routine. Snow lay along roofs and hedges like sheets tucked by a brisk nurse. Behind stone walls, soldiers waited for orders. The Germans here were not the shock troops of December. Many were tired men with frostbitten fingers, counting down to a surrender nobody had yet announced out loud. But tired men with guns can still do terrible arithmetic. The sergeant's patrol moved low, a thin line of breaths and boot creak, and the small, domestic clatter of hardware reluctantly arranged for violence. He chose routes like a man choosing words carefully in a room, with people who can change your life in a sentence. They came around a bend and saw it, a file of enemy soldiers, dozens, moving between a barn and a house, a kind of wartime tableau the manuals call an opportunity. The Germans were squared off into snow and fatigue, helmets tilted to catch as little wind as possible. They were, in a way, naked, exposed on a lane they probably judged safe 5 minutes earlier. Something in the sergeant arranged itself into clarity. Paratroopers live half their lives in moments like this, where training and nerve converge, and what separates disaster from legend is a decision so small, it hardly seems like a decision at all. He whispered, and his men blossomed into positions like shadows being sensible about their options. Then he stepped out from behind the hedge with the easy stride of a man carrying fire in his hands and certainty on his face. It is an ancient trick. Look as if the world belongs to you, and for a second, it might. His voice snapped across the cold like a rope. The German non-com at the head of the column, the only man who looked like he still owned any belief about how the day would go, hesitated. The hesitation was everything. The Thompson held the air between them in a new shape. The sergeant's men materialized along the edges of vision. The Germans' rifles were slung, their hands poked into pockets for warmth, their eyes unaccustomed to the idea that the sudden hawk in the lane belonged to the other side. It was theater, and he was good at it. Men with frost in their eyebrows and the kind of hunger that makes you philosophical put their hands up. This is the crux that makes historians' eyebrows lift and veterans' mouths twist with the memory of the way one heartbeat can change a war's geometry. A single U.S. sergeant and a handful of paratroopers rounded up an entire German platoon. The word captured does not catch the feel of it. The way silence transformed into a pile of rifles against a wall, into a line of men shuffling into a building, into the relief and menace that share a bench whenever prisoners are counted and herded. Inside the house, steam lifted from wet coats on hooks. Those who had just surrendered were suddenly aware of their breath, of the smell of sausage from a pot that had not been theirs 5 minutes ago. Their boots made a tacky sound on the floorboards, mud thawing. A sergeant left 2 men to stand guard while he pushed on. The war rewards momentum. It punishes anyone who lingers to admire a miracle. Paratroopers are taught to be greedy with opportunity. He stepped back into the cold with that briskness and kept moving because the day still had room for disaster, and he was determined to keep filling it with his voice instead. The village was a clutch of courtyards and outbuildings, the sort of rural puzzle that German platoons knew better than they wanted to, and Americans were learning at cost. At a corner, his patrol found another knot of resistance and untied it with a short, cruel conversation of bullets slapping stone. Snow puffed off wall edges like threatened birds. The ring of an empty brass casing on a doorstep sounded like a doorbell for a house whose occupants had long since moved into their own heads. Then he turned back to check on the prisoners. There's a line in every story of courage when the temperature of luck drops and glass cracks. The 2 guards were young. Youth does not mean foolish. It means lungs and nerves working at a speed that can betray even your best intentions. Behind a closed door, dozens of men with the muscle memory of drill and the fresh humiliation of capture wrestled with their new status. If you have ever crowded too many strangers into a small space and then closed a door on them, you know how quickly air can change personality. The sergeant pushed through the house and was halfway down a corridor when he understood. At the end of it, with a light from a narrow window, made a hard stripe across pine boards, an officer in field gray and a few men had reversed the order of the afternoon. He didn't see the 2 young Americans posted at the back of the room because they were on the floor. He saw instead the muzzle of a pistol come forward like a punctuation mark aimed directly at him. The German called out in the kind of English that knows the important words. Hands up. For a split second, time stretched to fit every possible version of what could happen next. He could count the dark bristles on the German officer's jaw, see the pale scar that ran like a fingernail mark across the man's cheek. He could feel the Thompson's weight warming the strap across his shoulder. The way a tool you've held for months becomes not merely an object, but a habit made of metal and intent. He could also see, blinking back through memory in a flash that had nothing of drama in it and everything of fact, the face of his mother in the doorway at home, holding a dish towel and pretending news didn't travel faster than it did. He smiled, not a big smile, not an American movie smile. A little slant that said, "You got me." His hands moved up. 1, 2, considerate of the pistol's nervous aim. The Germans shifted, the way men do when they believe the day has just handed them a tale to tell for years. His right hand reached casually for the sling, a lazy motion that could have been the hand of a tired man adjusting a strap so it wouldn't bite. The pistol wavered by an inch. The inch was a country you could build a life in. The sergeant's fingers found the Thompson's grip, and the lazy motion ended. It began. There is a sound a submachine gun makes in a room that is half thunder and half fabric tearing. The air buckled. The officer fell into his companions as if they were part of the furniture he owned. The line of prisoners' faces, coats, the complicated human geography of a group who had believed themselves reprieved broke into panic and then into the mathematics of surrender again. The sergeant moved the way men move when their bodies are ahead of their minds by a fraction. Economical, precise, racing the shrapnel of terror before it could explode into 100 private decisions. Behind him, his paratroopers answered his racket with their own, turning the ambush back on itself with the ferocity of men who had just seen their friends on the floor and decided to write a different ending. When it stopped, there were bodies, as war insists. There were also dozens of Germans pressed again to the walls, empty hands held up, eyes blown wide like a horse's when a car backfires. The guards groaned and were dragged into the land of the breathing. The prisoners were counted twice, 3 times. Weapons were kicked away. A pile of misbegotten courage lay tangled with coats, with the afternoon's dumb luck. The sergeant's heart hammered like a forge. He looked at his hands as if surprised to find them shaking. He had just captured, disarmed, then recaptured an entire German platoon through nerve and the kind of audacity that is a cousin of common sense. Outside, snow resumed its quiet terms. The war, offended by this interruption in its order, moved to reassert itself in other rooms, on other streets, with other men. But for the moment, here, a single sergeant's refusal to accept the plot dealt to him had turned a corridor into a chapter worth remembering. This is that chapter. It begins with a pistol at a belly and ends with a winter village clearing its throat for a new day. To understand how a man arrives at a door with a pistol pressed into his gut and decides to smile, you could start in a steel town near Pittsburgh, where winter has its own rules and work, teaches you what your hands are capable of before your mind gets certain. He was Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr., born to a place that smelled of coal smoke and hot steel, where rivers braided a city together, and men learned humility in this presence of furnaces that could melt iron and patience in the presence of paydays that sometimes didn't. He did not enter the war as legend. He entered as an American of a certain time, young enough to believe that big events can be shaped by small hands, old enough to understand that somebody has to carry boxes as well as rifles. The Army put him into the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a Ravens Red Devil unit stitched into the 82nd Airborne Division's nervous system. Paratroopers, the experiment that went right, men who learned to jump into smoke and confusion and make clarity with their boots and bayonets, or with whatever they could find in the dark when the drops scattered them like punctuation across enemy countryside. At Camp Landing in Fort Benning, he found out what it meant to be airborne, the rigid grace of drill replaced by the animal geometry of a parachute harness. The way your stomach learns to listen to wind, the way your heart learns that the ground is always both friend and enemy. He trained under men who thought that saving your life might begin by making you hate them. He learned how to land without shattering your legs. He learned how to find your unit in a hedgerow world where nothing looks like the photographs. He learned, most of all, that the Army cannot function at scale without people like him, non-commissioned officers who translate officers' intentions into meals, ammunition, shelter, and the sort of discipline that doesn't crack when the weather turns or the enemy decides to be unusually imaginative. By June 1944, he wore wings that told other men he had done a thing most people will never do once and never want to do twice. The 82nd dropped into Normandy on a night that is now embalmed in language. D-Day so hardened by repetition that we forget how little it looked like itself at the time. He hung under silk somewhere over hedgerows and orchard walls and fields wet with dew and fear. When boots met earth, his job title supply sergeant did not mean he sought shells or waited on a loading dock. It meant that he found the men he could find, led where leadership didn't wait for rank to arrive, and made himself useful with whatever was at hand. Paratrooper supply sergeants in combat areas acquire a second unofficial billet. They become glue. They know who needs boots 2 sizes bigger and who has been trembling quietly in a corner and will be useful again if given an order that fits like a glove. They know how to count ammunition and courage. They know where the dead are because they have to know. In France, he learned the taste of sleep, stolen sitting up, and the smell of bread, commandeered from a bakery whose ovens were surprised by the war's insistence on fresh supplies. He learned, too, how quickly the line between rifleman and clerk evaporates at a crossroads, where a German half-track is trying to decide if your corner is worth dying for. In September, Holland. The 82nd went north as part of an audacious plan to punch a corridor along the Rhine by seizing bridges like beads on a string. The 508th wrapped itself around Nijmegen and the Canal Country that looks quaint in photographs and feels like a maze in rain. He earned decorations there not for inventory accuracy, but for the kind of leadership that threads chaos. Paratroopers in Holland were caught between the speed of their ambition and the slowness of the ground under bicycles and boots. They fought house to house and mile to mile under skies that seemed permanently to forecast either miracles or funerals. He became First Sergeant of Company C, the old-fashioned way, by surviving and by being good at the parts of soldiering that officers rely on when their maps begin to make less sense than they did in a tent. A first sergeant in a line company is a father, a creditor, a judge, and sometimes a friend who does not say the word out loud. He is the bulletproof vest for his commander's better instincts. He is also, in airborne units, a man who has signed an implied contract to be the last to eat and the first to go through the door. Then December came down like a curtain. The Ardennes, with its deep woods and small valleys, was supposed to be where units rested and remade themselves. The German offensive shattered that premise. The Bulge began as a surprise attack and turned into a grand correction. The 508th, like the rest of the 82nd, threw itself into the cold to plug holes that weren't on last week's map. Trucks froze, men froze, the very idea of comfort froze. The battalion position maps from those weeks are portraits of stubbornness, inked lines on snow. January 1945 was a month of taking back what the Germans had borrowed. It was also a month where ranks blurred because Jeff in the kitchen and Mike in the ammo store and Sergeant so-and-so with the lists. And the ledger suddenly had to do the most elemental task of all: point the barrel the right way and move forward. The 508th fought through villages whose names tasted of German and dialect and hunger. Men fell and got back up with snow caked on their backs like icing. The 82nd's regiments, hardened by months of improvisation, worked like hands that have learned to find tools in the dark. And that winter, the little things mattered more. A wool scarf given by a clerk. A ration of coffee warmed in a tin, saved for a man shaking too hard to light his own cigarette. A supply sergeant who had been a clerk on Tuesday, leading a patrol on Thursday, because the man who would have done it was warming under a blanket that did not move anymore. He wore his responsibility like another layer. He did not talk about it. He issued orders and challenged passwords, and honed the sixth sense that lets you know when a room, a lane, a woodline is on your side or about to betray you. The ethos of men like him is not mysterious. It is compact. Keep your people alive. Do what the moment requires. Don't ask your men to take a risk you won't take. If you have to bluff, bluff like the world depends on it. If you have to shoot, shoot first and correctly. If you have to go back for the wounded, go. In a war of giant defenses and airborne armadas, it is easy to forget how much turned on people like him, making judgments in fog up to their knees. By the time the patrol stepped into the village with the Thompson stock snug into his shoulder, and the barrel pointing the way a dog points a covey, he was the sum of all that. He had learned what his face could do to other men's decisions. He had learned that the line between a platoon and a mob is sometimes the confidence of one man standing in a lane. He had learned the price of hesitation and the dividend of momentum. He had also learned something the history books calibrate too mathematically. That courage isn't a switch you flip. It's a habit you carry, an accumulation of small refusals to be governed by fear. None of that makes you bulletproof when a pistol is pressed into your belly. But it explains why your hands know which strap to touch while your mouth is pledging obedience you have no intention of delivering. It explains why, in the darkest corridor of a house that smelled of boiled potatoes and boots, the man from a steel town who kept track of winter socks and Thompson magazines would decide to change the rules again. The reputations of soldiers often ride on seconds. The careers of sergeants ride on hours, days, months of being adequate in a profession where adequacy takes a peculiar courage. The winter had tested him in that long, grinding way. The day in the village would test him in the seconds. The two were not separate tests. They were the same exam asked in different languages. When he faced a filing cabinet, he solved problems. When he faced a pistol, he solved problems. War is a bureaucracy of terror. He understood both columns. For those wanting perfect chronology and hard coordinates, this can be frustrating. Much in these days was unphotographed, unfilmed, logged by men who were both exhausted and humble about their own drama. Reports say, near Holzheim, or in the vicinity. The snow in memories drifts across exact dates like it drifted across roads. But what is clear, what is preserved in the citations and the eyewitness testimonies, transcribed in unadorned Army English, is the shape of what happened. A sergeant and his small patrol captured a German platoon. Some of those prisoners fought back, and through a violent clarity, he reasserted control and turned an enemy's brief hope into surrender again. He did not invent himself that day. He revealed himself. He gave the war, briefly, an example worth pausing for. And it began, as such moments often do, with routines, a patrol brief, a map corner weighted down with a coffee cup, a check of weapons that had been checked 3 times already, in a winter that did not care what you were about to do unless you taught it to. The cavalry of January is not a trumpet. It is the creak of a sling, the hiss of breath in a scarf, the tiny squeal of dry snow under boots. When his patrol eased along the lane into the village, daylight was a gray generosity, and the world's color palette ran from iron to chalk, with only the occasional black stroke of a bare tree to insist that contrast still existed. Behind him, one man hummed under his breath, the way you do when the cold insists on owning your teeth. Another mumbled passwords to himself like catechism. The sergeant's world narrowed to immediate math. Distance to the barn, angle of door swing, height of the hedge that could hide a man who believes in the old gods and a man who believes in luck. They turned a corner, and there was the German platoon, held in the grid of his attention as if someone had snapped a chalk line across the lane and called for professionalism. The enemy moved like people do after too many cold mornings, carefully, with no particular belief that anything very good or very bad would happen before lunch. Rifles were slanted at negligent angles. The officer at the front shared the common European face of winter wartime. Inadequate sleep, and honesty about his own survival that hummed just behind his eyes. Epaulets that still meant something to him, if no longer to the earth he walked on. The sergeant stepped into the flow of the day, not as a disruptor so much as a redirection. His voice was confident without being noisy. He knew the German command words. With 2 syllables he could remap a room. Hand ho, hands up. He did not bark, he suggested. He implied that the rest of this would go better if everyone played his part. The Thompson's mouth enforced the etiquette. It is easy, from a distance, to think these moments are always blood and thunder. Often they are practical. A column of men whose rifles are not ready is vulnerable to the kind of confidence a paratrooper carries like a second weapon. The Germans stared at him as if a manifestly improbable thing had just proposed. Itself and their bodies had decided to accept before their minds could veto. Hands went up, one after another, a clumsy sea of fingers and palms. A few rifles made sad sounds as they were placed against a wall. Someone swore softly, and it sounded like a man stubbed his toe rather than surrendered his war. His men moved in with the choreography of practiced audacity. One covered the far end of the lane. Another counted softly, the numbers making white puffs. The third nudged a hesitant man with the barrel of a carbine in the gentle way a shepherd persuades a stubborn sheep to rejoin the flock. Within minutes, the platoon was parked inside a house that smelled of human life soup, laundry soap, stove heat, smoke. Captured men fall quiet in such rooms. They become aware of tables, of worn floors, of pictures on walls that seem suddenly important because they have nothing else left in their day that belongs to them. He left 2 guards, lads who had the watchful eyes of people who had not learned yet how quickly authority can reverse. They set their backs to a wall and their boots to a floor pattern and took up the guard's ancient posture, knees slightly bent to carry boredom more easily, fingers laid along metal, because numb hands drop things you need to keep hold of. The sergeant clapped one on the shoulder, an old code of trust, and moved out again. Because the morning had made itself into a field, one could harvest if one didn't waste time. Down the street, a machine gun chattered, and directly after the sound of ricochet was the thud slap of someone hitting snow in surprise rather than injury. The patrol flinched, recovered, and cut across a courtyard where laundry hung frozen into flags aimed at any wind that remembered courage. A door blew back on its hinges, the sort of small domestic violence that tells you men have been moving through this space to the rhythm of fear. He pushed on through a room where a cat groomed itself with a slow dignity that made you ache, into a tight yard where footprints told a story as clearly as a deposition. His mind turned tracks into narrative. 2 men, running, a third wounded, dragged. Someone stopped here to fire. Someone else ducked there and pressed his hand against the wall and left a little print of skin and grit and winter. They swept and cleared and argued with machine gun positions in the compact language of grenades and angles and timing. The enemy here were under orders to hold, but under the weather to the degree that holding meant mostly skirmishing and backing away with the retreat of their illusions. A house at the corner resisted and then collapsed into the piece of houses after the men had decided its fate. He took a breath in the doorway and realized his heart had been beating as if some other drummer had set the tempo higher. Back to the prisoners, he told himself. Back to the house where the world was simple, because the arithmetic of who owned what had been solved. But the door opened onto a new problem. The room had changed temperature. He felt it in the way you feel when a friend stops laughing in the middle of a joke, and you don't yet know why. The German officer stood in a wedge of window light. The angle made his face look better than it deserved to. A vulnerable cheekbone, a hint of youth under grime. He had a pistol. The guards' rifles were on the floor, kicked into a corner with a contempt born of necessity. The other prisoners had rearranged themselves into the geometry of revolt, a crowd behind their man, their eyes bright with the fierce happiness of a chance. "Hands up," the officer said, his voice careful because English was a coat he only wore in emergencies. The sergeant's laugh, small, friendly, a sound meant to confuse a man holding a pistol, was almost inaudible. His fingers pushed the Thompson strap with a movement that would not have upset a house cat. His right hand slid down to the pistol grip, found it, curled around it with the muscle memory of 1,000 fiddlings at the edge of sleep and responsibility. He decided in that second to refuse the role he had been assigned by other men's sudden bravery. He decided to be rude in the particular way soldiers can be when they are risking the rest of their life to puncture a script. The first burst caught the officer high, tore the afternoon into hard-edged pieces. Men went to ground in a communal flinch, as if the room itself had ended. The sergeant moved with the economy of someone who had trained for a world that does not like delays. The Thompson stitched a line across the front of the formation. He was not there to murder men who had already surrendered. He was there to collapse a new mutiny back into the only acceptable order left. War does not offer good choices in such rooms. It offers short ones and the obligation to make them. The effect was immediate. Fear is an electrical current. It ran through the prisoners and came out in a hum that sounded more like pleading than argument. Hands returned to their original job. The backs of heads suddenly had fascinating details. The few brave ones who might have thrown themselves forward to get their pistol or their moment reconsidered, because what they had just seen told them that their best hope lay in discipline they had abandoned a moment ago. The paratroopers outside came in with their own noise and reinforced reality the way soldiers do when a single man has kept a door open to it. Aftershots always counting. Someone has to drop into the arithmetic and make sense of what's left. The sergeant's men stacked rifles, enemy and friendly, and kicked strays into a corner. They looked to the guards and got them up, muttered quick sympathy the way soldiers do. "You lucky so-and-so. You'll hate the taste of this memory, but at least you'll have the privilege of hating it." A medic shoved through with a face that looked like it had been carved from goodwill and fatigue. He touched everything quickly, the priest of a secular rite that asks too much of too few. 21 Germans on the floor, the rest upright and contrite. Numbers that would go on a report later, plain and unpoetic. The part of the story that is the hardest to explain is what it feels like in the gut of a man who has just chosen. to make gunfire in a room full of prisoners, rather than accept the reversal of the minute. There is no glory in it, no triumph that does not melt as soon as you see a body trying not to be a body anymore. But there is also no alternative if you accept the responsibility that comes with rank, and with the decision you made an hour earlier when you told men to put their hands up. He had made promises to both sides of this situation, and he kept the only one he could keep without betraying the rest. Outside, the village had that peculiar quiet war sometimes gives you after a storm, when you can hear a stovepipe breathing and the click of a distant bicycle leaning against a wall. He went out into it and looked at the sky, a small, mean sky that day, and allowed himself the small collapse that makes men human between orders. Another patrol would come. Another house. Another knot of men determined to be an exception. For the time being, he had accomplished something that would be written up in language that didn't capture the cold or the smell or the little laugh he made as he pretended to surrender. Later, when the report was written, it would be careful. The army is good at careful language, displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life. The formula that tries to wrap in a sentence the way a man resets the world in a corridor with a submachine gun. Eyewitnesses would say what they saw. The guards would stop shaking. The captured Germans would smoke with that savage gratitude the defeated grant themselves when death has postponed its appointment. The men in his company would tell the story with a mix of awe and teasing that passes for love between people who carry rifles together. And somewhere, a clerk would type the words, "captured an entire German platoon," without understanding how big the room was where those words had to be decided.
When heroism is an accident of seconds, the paperwork that follows is an exercise in patience. He went from kitchen table chaos to a tent where the air was full of the dust of typing. The army clerk on the other side of the folding desk asked questions in the tidy voice of someone doing a job that is both important and infinitely repeatable. Who, when, where, how many, what did you do next? Ink bled slightly on the paper because tents are humid with breath and weather and a sense of being halfway between event and archive. But he sat with that posture soldiers acquire when they are being asked to translate their body's decisions into words. Shoulders a little hunched, hands perched on knees, as if the next order might require jumping. He described the man with the pistol. He described the strap and the moment when the room believed one outcome and got another. He used small words, not because he was simple, but because there is a grace in refusing to decorate something already heavy. I shot him first, he said, and then he stopped talking for a minute because sentences sometimes end where breath begins again. Lost in the creases of the paperwork are the other casualty lists from the day. The little papers that said who got soup and who got morphine and who got a letter begun by someone with a slow hand. The war rolled on. Holzheim, or the place that stands in for Holzheim in your mind, shifted from front line to rear area in the way villagers do, not by moving, but by the line moving past them like a weather system. Men scrubbed mud off boots. Trucks rattled. Ambulances whined like insects. A chaplain unstuck a hymn from the roof of his mouth and gave it to a room full of men with frost-bitten hands. He did not leave the war because of one day. He stayed with his company, because that is what first sergeants do when the best thing that can be said is that tomorrow will still be in need of courage. But the army, miserly with its highest praise because it must be, did something it does rarely. It wrote Medal of Honor next to his name. It is an uncomfortable decoration. It sits on the chest like a weight as much as a jewel, because it announces to strangers something your friends already know, and it sets a man on a small island away from his peers when all he wants is to shoulder in among them. He wore it the way a man wears a scar carved into both worlds, proud, quiet, and aware that the ones who matter will know what the metal cost. In the citation, there is language that belongs to the military's particular poetry, gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The economy of the words hides the way courage often springs from a deep sense of duty rather than beyond it. He was doing his job, keeping his people safe, fulfilling an obligation to prisoners that had been remade by their decision to become combatants again, seeing a problem and solving it. The army's highest honor often goes to men who insist they were doing only what anyone would do. The regularity of that sentence in the mouths of the decorated should not make us believe it. Anyone would not do what he did. He did it. He had been decorated before Bronze Stars for Holland, for being where the bullets were thickest and deciding to stand and direct traffic under fire when the road needed to be cleared, because otherwise the bridge would choke and a plan 13 levels above him would fail. He carried those awards with a reflexive embarrassment that reads, from the distance of decades, as grace when the army shook his hand. He put those hands back on the work they knew, counting ammunition, counting men, counting on the habits that had gotten him to that corridor and through it. The last months of the war were a mix of advance and aftermath. The 508th pushed across the Siegfried Line through defences that the Germans had been proud to build years earlier and were now too tired to maintain. Pillboxes that had once represented practicality and menace now sat like teeth in a mouth that had lost the rest of its appetite. In towns where the facades still stood proudly, even with a third of their windows missing, the 82nd folded itself into a new job: occupation and policing, feeding and fixing, the awkwardness of being liberators in a place that hadn't ordered the dish you're now serving it. He brought his men through to the armistice with the same attention to the details of surviving. The last day before it's over can be cruel. The shell that tries to make you a final footnote is always out there with your name scratched on it by chance. He counted heads. He sent men to shave and sleep and eat. He issued instructions with the ordinary voice that once had barked in a corridor. He let laughter into the company street like it was a permission slip. When the order came down to stop shooting, he stopped. Then he sat on a box and let his hands hang between his knees, and felt for the first time in months how heavy his body had become with interrupted sleep. Home is a funny word after a war. It is both magnet and mystery, and the soldier returning is more changed than the rooms he enters know what to do with. He went back to Pennsylvania Hills Rivers, Neighborhoods where porchers collect evening conversations took off the uniform that had pressed a rhythm onto his days and put on a civilian one. His next job seems, at first, like a contradiction, then like a resolution. He spent decades working for the Veterans Administration, helping other men who came home from their own corridors of suddenness and their own slow-motion bad dreams. The bureaucrat's desk after the war is a front line of a different sort. The forms are still crisp, the language still careful. Who, when, where, how many? What did you do next? But now he sat on the side of the table that says yes more often than no, that finds a way for the war to make can and will out of a body and a mind scuffed by the business of surviving. He did not become a celebrity. He became an answer in certain rooms. Who was the sergeant who captured that German platoon and then captured them again when they forgot themselves? The name would be offered with a shrug that meant reverence disguised as practicality. Leonard A. Funk Jr. He died in 1992. Not dramatically, not on a battlefield, but in the way most lives end, a day like any other becoming a day like no other. He left behind a file folder thick with official approvals and a thinner sheaf of photographs where you can see a jaw set for winter and a mischievous light in the eye that might have been the same little smile he gave a pistol. The place where it happened, call it Holzheim, because that is what the citation calls it, does not remember him with a monument you can see from the road. Not all history is designed to be found by casual motorists. The real memorials for moments like his are made in the way sergeants in airborne companies talk to their men. In the way modern soldiers are taught about cold rooms and sudden decisions, in the quiet doctrine about how to handle prisoners with dignity until dignity becomes an opening for lethal error. His story turns up in training rooms now and then, as a reminder that being decisive and being humane are not opposites, that the rules of war exist and must be honored until the other side throws them away in a tired, dangerous room. He would not have called himself a philosopher, but the life that followed his winter insisted on certain ideas. The rarest heroism is the kind that accepts a return to ordinary work. He filed forms. He told stories when asked, and changed the subject when the story tried to become the main event in a day that had groceries and grandchildren and a dog that needed a walk. He wore his medal to events where boys in scout uniforms learned to look at him as if he were a knight from a book, and he replied with a handshake and a question about their school projects because he understood the danger of being the hero in the room. It can make others feel like spectators in their own life. If you walk into the paratrooper museums and small-town display cases where regimental histories live between glass and polite dust, you'll find his name. The caption will be brief. It can't capture the smell of boiled potatoes and fear or snow, or the way paper will always be smaller than a corridor's echo. But it will do the one thing the army learned to do well by 1945. It will make sure a stranger can find his way into the part of the war where simplicity and nerve walked into the same room and refused to get in each other's way.
Every war story wants to trick you into conclusions. The broad ones, armies arrowing across maps, cities burning. Treaties invite the obvious. Size is destiny, and courage is a large word. The smaller ones, like this, nudge gently toward a lesson about audacity, about the human ability to rewrite a scene by refusing to accept its premise. But if you stand in the room with him, not literally, we cannot, but imaginatively, and feel the smell of wet wool and old food, and the punk of gunpowder as it burns out of air, what you might hear more clearly than the lesson is the question: who are we to each other in rooms like that? The sergeant's moment is not only about speed and nerve. It is also about obligation. Prisoners are supposed to be safe, because we insist on the idea that war can be contained within rules, and that some dignity survives, even when weapons want to spread. Those men had surrendered. When a few decided the rules were a luxury they could not afford, the room shed its privileges and became again a battlefield with all the injustice and immediacy that word contains. His job was to reimpose the rule, not just of his rifle, but of order itself. That distinction matters if you want to hold on to your belief that war has a spine and not just an appetite. Sergeants like him form the bridge between intent and outcome. We pay attention to generals and their plans because the mind likes the geometry. We recite the names of officers because their signatures stick to operations the way a flag sticks to a pole. But in a frozen Belgian corridor, where the plans have shrunk to the width of a doorway, it is the non-com who decides whether the story breaks one way or another. The United States learned in that war what every professional army relearns in every war. Leadership is often an act of translation. Orders come down with the logic of staff work. They are executed with the messy urgency of weather and fear, and kitchens that still smell of Tuesday. His story also confirms something we resist, because we like to think decency is always gentle. Sometimes decency has a loud voice. Sometimes it involves firing first, because the idea of generosity has just been weaponized by someone on the other side of the room. It is not comfortable to say out loud, but it belongs in the same breath as the parts of the story that are easier to tell, like how he transitioned after the war to a life of helping other veterans, how he refused the temptation to make his own heroism a career. The same man who pulled the trigger in a crowded room of prisoners is the man who later spent years telling other veterans in so many words, "Here's how we can make this work for you now." At the scale of a campaign, nothing in his story changes the lines on the map. At the scale of a company, it changed who came home, whose children were born after 1945, who sat on porches on hot nights in the 1960s, telling stories in which they played a role rather than being an audience to someone else's. The tension between the big and the small is the warp and weft of how we talk about war. Both are necessary. The large scale tells us why. The small scale tells us how. There is a way to turn his moment into a parable about American pluck. Resist it. Pluck is a word people reach for when they want to make hard things easier to look at. What he had was craft, practice, nerve, and a working moral compass calibrated not in a monastery, but in the barracks, the drop zone, and the mess line. His courage was not decorative. It was the sort that has dirt under its nails, the sort that doesn't always know, in advance, that it can pay the price. He didn't jump into D-Day and fight through Holland and bend January to his will because he believed he was inevitable. He did it because the habit of competence turns into a virtue under pressure. If you carry this story out of our film and into your own life, carry it as a reminder about the weight and promise of being the one in the room who must decide. Most of us will never face a pistol at the end of a corridor with 50 men behind it and 2 of our own on the floor. But we will face rooms that have expectations and scripts that need to be changed by somebody willing to smile in a tight way and reach for the strap that holds the responsibility to their body. In workplaces, in families, in communities trying to remember how to share obligations, there are moments when decency must be loud and the habit of competence must be brave. The winter village and the little laugh, the Thompson and the way the prisoner's hands rose, the guard's slow return to the kind of shaking you can recover from these details, will fade into the large story of a war that ended. Time eats the specifics, but the outline remains. A U.S. sergeant captured a German platoon, not because he wanted a headline, but because the room asked him to run the scene, and he knew how. When the scene changed on him, he changed it back. We could end by stacking up the numbers 21 dead, scores recaptured, a medal with a ribbon the color of sky and blood, and counting them out like coins. Or we could end with a map with arrows, making sure you know exactly which ridge and which village and which administrative district of Belgium held its breath for a few minutes while two men decided who would be in charge. But the best ending is simpler. It is a nod to men like him, who will always exist where big plans brush against narrow corridors, who carry, without applause, the authority that makes other people's hope plausible, who go home when it's over and take a job that pays the rent and tells them in a quiet clerk's voice that making a different kind of sense in the lives of strangers is now what is required. So, the U.S. sergeant who captured an entire German platoon. His name is Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr., if you want to write it down, late of a steel town where the rivers meet. He learned how to keep a company alive, and in a winter hallway, how to keep a story honest when it threatened to become a tragedy. He is a lesson in the kind of courage that does not mistake volume for force or metal for meaning. He is, in the ledger we keep when we are trying to decide what kind of people we wish to be, an entry filed under, when the room turns, turn it back. History is full of doors like that. Most of us walk past them because we are lucky. If a day comes when you find yourself in one, remember the little laugh, the inch you need to move a strap, the difference between bluster and authority. Remember that on a winter day in a small Belgian village, a sergeant did not ask the world for permission to be decisive. He accepted the responsibility the room offered, and he fulfilled it. That is, in the end, the quiet call this story makes, not to glory, but to the steady habit of making courage useful.